You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 33, Ancient Egyptian Goddesses of Necropolises. Since it's Women's History Month, I wanted to share some info about the goddesses who don't get a lot of pop culture attention, but they're still fairly important to the ancient Egyptian belief system. Now, there are many goddesses associated with death in ancient Egypt, from the embalming process to the journey through the ancient Egyptian underworld known as the Duat, and all sorts of places in between. But for many, their role in the death process is just one of their many aspects that they took on throughout the daily lives of people. These are the goddesses whose primary role was to protect, nourish, and sometimes punish both the physical bodies in the necropolis and the souls of the deceased in the afterlife. So in this episode, we'll meet Imentet, who was the personification of the West, Khefethernebes and Meretseger, who were both from the Theban Necropolis, and Hapetnebes, who is from the Abydan Necropolis. These four goddesses provide examples of the ways that ancient Egyptians interacted with the natural world and sacred spaces. And since ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs heavily reflect day-to-day life, especially tombs, they also reflect the roles and responsibilities expected of mortal women who lived during the dynastic period of Egypt. So now let's get started with the first of our four goddesses. In the ancient Egyptian belief system, the sun god Ra entered into the underworld known as the Duat as the sun sets in the west every single day. He then has to go through a dangerous journey in order to be birthed anew each morning by the sky goddess. Their entire belief system in ancient Egypt was based on cycles of life, death, and rebirth, just like the Nile's annual cycle, and it was the same for people too. Since the West is where the sun god died and began his journey to rebirth, it made sense that burial customs followed this divine pattern, so the land to the west of the Nile became seen as the place where the dead began their journey through the Duat too. So it makes sense that the personification of the West is the first of our goddesses to appear in the archaeological record. Her name was Imentet or Amentet, different pronunciations depending on different schools of hieroglyphics, but her name was the same as the ancient Egyptian word for West. She represented the West both as a physical location and as a metaphysical location as the entrance to the Duat. And as the goddess of the West, the necropolises on the west side of the Nile were part of her protected domain. Amentet welcomed the recently deceased and then offered them bread and water as they started their journey through the Duat, which is a reflection of the social role of living women in ancient Egypt at the time as well. Women who were part of the wealthy elite who owned estates, especially large ones, held the title of Nebet Per, which was mistress of the house. They oversaw all of the domestic and economic responsibilities, especially ensuring the household always had food. And based on scenes of feasts that have been found at different sites across Egypt, it was also common for elite households to host feasts, which the mistress of the house would be in charge of. During later periods, when Amentet was associated with the goddess Nephthys, she would also have the title of Nebet Per added to her epithets. This reflected her role and Nephthys's role as the guardians of the afterlife, where they would feed and sustain and nourish those who were carrying on their journey. The first archaeological evidence we have of Amentet appears in Saqqara during the Old Kingdom. She's actually in the very first pyramid texts that are in the Pyramid of Unas, and these say that she welcomed Unas, blessed him, and then sent him along on his journey. She doesn't appear outside of royal tombs during the Old Kingdom, and even her mentions then are still more rare as opposed to some of the other goddesses. And this tells us that she was originally part of the royal belief system, or the royal cult, as we call it in Egyptology, which these deities were not always the same as the deities the average people knew or worshipped. They're just the ones that, because the elite and the royals worshipped them, we find the most archaeological evidence of them because they have the funds to leave those statues and inscriptions and whatever behind. But as with most deities and essentially the entire mummification process, Imentet gained popularity during the Middle Kingdom with people outside of the royal family, like elites as well, and some high-level artisans. Generally, she was still found in the Memphite Necropolis near Saqqara, Giza, Dashur, etc., that area where the pyramids are located. And she was no longer only part of the royal cult, though, so we see more and more mentions of her in other tombs and not just the royals. During the 11th dynasty, the capital moved from Memphis to Thebes briefly, and she moved there with the royal court, because during the 11th dynasty, that's the first evidence we have of Imentet outside of the Memphite necropolis. During the New Kingdom, Thebes became the capital of Egypt again and flourished during this time. And then most references of Imentet, however you want to pronounce it, are found during this period in the Theban Necropolis, which is where like the Valley of the Queens, the Valley of the Kings, Deir el-Bahri are. They're all near modern-day Luxor. During the 19th dynasty in the New Kingdom specifically, Imentet was paired with Ra-Harakti, who was a combination of Ra and Horus, so he represented both the sun and the horizons. In the tomb of Nefertari, who was the great royal wife of Ramses II, there are beautiful, well-preserved depictions of Imentet and her consort Ra-Harakti. From the 19th dynasty onward, she became merged with Iset, or Isis as we call her now, Hathor, and Nephthys, who were also three goddesses associated with the afterlife, but also they had major roles in life and fertility as well. So that's why they're not within this Goddesses of the Necropolises bubble. During that period, it was sometimes just added on as an aspect or epithet of these three goddesses. And sometimes she was also more associated with the smaller local goddesses that we'll be looking at next. But then during the Third Intermediate period and Ptolemaic periods, Imentet makes a comeback as her own unique goddess, and she becomes frequently painted in almost life-size proportions on wooden coffins of the elite, especially on the baseboards where the mummies would rest, so that she was symbolically embracing the dead as they enter the afterlife. Our next goddess is named Khefethernebes, which means she who faces her lord, or she who is in front of her lord. She appears in the archaeological record first during the Middle Kingdom, but during this time there's only one or two examples. She gained popularity during the New Kingdom, but she was eventually absorbed by other goddesses. Like Imentet, she welcomed and fed the newly deceased as they began their journey through the Duat, but her domain was much smaller than Imentet's. Instead of all of the West, it's theorized that she is a personification of a specific place within the Theban Necropolis, but Egyptologists aren't sure exactly where. It's not like it was written out for us in every text. Most references to Khefethernebes come from Thebes, or also mention Thebes alongside her. But she wasn't the patron goddess of Thebes. Thebes had its own separate goddess who was the personification of both the city and the entire nome. Her name was Waset, which was the same as the ancient Egyptian name for the city. Thebes came from the Greeks. Earlier mentions of Khefethernebes actually list her in addition to Waset as goddesses side by side, not as if they're the same goddess or place. One example is a rock inscription that was found in modern-day Sudan, which was Nubia at the time. It dates to Thutmose I, and it says that he was seated on the throne of Horus to expand the borders of Waset and the fields or district of Khefethernebes. The earliest text that identifies Waset Khefethernebes as the same goddess is found on a stela that was commissioned by Hatshepsut, and it shows her dressed in the typical depictions of Waset with the symbol for the city and names her as Waset Khefethernebes. And then later in the texts, Hatshepsut's stela mentions Khefethernebes as a location, stating that she rebuilt that location and, quote, its river canal banks or just riverbanks were strengthened with stone. It's hard to translate some words in ancient Egyptian because they don't appear in the records a lot. That's why there's some that are unclear, like, is this river or is this canal? The river implies more natural. The canal implies it was further away and there was irrigation systems leading to it. So again, it's kind of hard to tell. In the text that's on one of the pylons in Karnak, there's a place that's called the Cemetery of Khefethernebes. And all three of these examples imply that she could be the personification of either the west bank of the Nile, which is directly across from Thebes, that's towards the necropolis, or she could have been the valley that's between the west bank of the Nile and the necropolis, or she could have been the part of the Theban Necropolis that we now call the necropolis of Al-Qurna, which is next to Deir el-Bahri. And that's where Hatshepsut's temple is, and we know it was a sacred burial place for quite a while. And so it's possible that she was just a local deity who is part of the personal beliefs of the average people, but then she got absorbed over time as the capital grew, which is similar to what happened to the next goddess we'll meet. Or she could have been a completely new creation meant to denote a specific district or part of Thebes. And it was at this point, especially in the late Middle Kingdom and in the New Kingdom, it was fairly popular to personify places as goddesses. The next goddess that we're going to learn about is Meretseger, and she was also part of the Theban Necropolis, and she was specifically sacred to the workers of Deir el-Medina before she became part of the larger religious system that was included in the pharaoh's tombs. So curiously, Khefethernebes and Meretseger were never merged despite their very close proximity. So again, it's very interesting to see, and that's kind of what implies that Khefethernebes was very specifically localized to Thebes and not so much deeper into the necropolis. Meretseger first appears in the 18th dynasty, and then she disappears at the end of the 20th dynasty as Deir el-Medina was abandoned. So she was essentially purely for this place. Unlike some of the other goddesses who kind of got transported around as the capital city moved or because they had spread further, Meretseger stayed confined to Deir el-Medina and the craftsmen in the tombs here. She is the most frequently mentioned deity in all of the artifacts and texts found at Deir el-Medina. If you want to know more about the city, the previous episode is all about it if you haven't listened yet. So her cult clearly began with the workers here. And over time, there's a pattern where she kind of makes her way up the ladder of eventually making it into the royal cult during the time of Amenhotep II. He ruled about halfway through the 18th dynasty and several generations after Meretseger first appeared at Deir el-Medina. Meretseger was specifically associated with cobras and either depicted as a cobra with a woman head or a cobra with the solar disk and two ostrich feathers on her head, or she was a cobra with a solar disk that had the bovine horns of Hathor whenever she got merged more with Hathor later. Her name, Meretseger, translates to she who loves silence, which makes sense. The desert on the west side of the Nile is very, very quiet, and you're going to be in a sacred place. So the combination of the physical reality of the desert there that is silent, it's part of the ecosystem, on top of which it is such a sacred place. You're not really going there to be loud all of the time. Meretseger is the personification of a specific sacred landmark within the Theban Necropolis, too. So she wasn't just a broad concept for the necropolis. There's a hill that's naturally shaped like a pyramid, especially when it's seen from the entrance to the Valley of the Kings, and it's seen as her physical manifestation on Earth. A sanctuary that was dedicated to both her and Ta, who was the god of crafters, was built nearby at Deir el-Medina by cutting artificial caves into the side of a ravine that's at the base of the hill known as Meretseger, that's on the path between the village and then the tombs where they worked. So basically, people would be walking by this sanctuary every single day, probably giving a little bit of a blessing here and there. But then we see there's a lot of texts and stela that are dedicated whenever people have more serious concerns. And it's thanks to these that we know that she was both revered and feared as a guardian of the necropolis, especially because she was depicted as a cobra more often than not. She was said to bite any who intended to steal or damage the tombs that were within the necropolis. And we see a lot of evidence of the workers specifically giving her offerings in order to protect them as they work or as important things are coming up in their lives. And there are also, interestingly, some stela or dedication texts that are basically, there are different workers who were essentially confessing to her, like they're confessing their sins, what they did wrong, and how they got penance. And so it's very interesting. We can see so many specific details into people's lives based on what they felt that they needed to tell the goddess. After Amenhotep's tomb, she does appear in a few other royal tombs, especially various Ramses throughout the 19th dynasty. But as I said, then once the 20th dynasty ends, it was pretty much the collapse of dynastic Egypt, the collapse of the late Bronze Age, and that's when Meretseger disappears from the archaeological record, and we don't see her appearing as an epithet for any of the other goddesses who carried on into the late period, Ptolemaic period, or Roman period. Meretseger wasn't the only goddess associated with cobras, and there's no male gods associated with them. Apep, or Apophis, is the most famous snake god of the Egyptian pantheon, and he's never depicted with a hood or markings like a cobra. And that's because female cobras are more aggressive than males, and one of their only species of snakes that actually defends their eggs during the entire incubation period, instead of just laying the eggs and then abandoning them. So Meretseger's role was a maternal one, even though she wasn't specifically associated with childbirth, and she didn't have any children of her own within her mythology. There are a few examples from Deir el-Medina of her depicted alongside goddesses of childbirth, like Tawaret, but she's a protector for a child as they grow and not as they were born. Meretseger is like one of the protective, independent aunties of the pantheon. I can't say for certain that ancient Egyptian women were typically seen as fierce and deadly, but it is a pretty good assumption that there's at least a little reflection of reality there, considering how many goddesses are associated with deadly animals. And it would make sense that there would be a protective auntie dynamic given the whole concept of it takes a village to raise a child. You're never going to have just one caregiver for a child in ancient Egypt. During the New Kingdom especially, we know that women had a lot of autonomy and rights, considering we have the Will of Naunakte, which I shared in the previous episode, and Hatshepsut ruled on her own and even claimed the title of king, which she made it very clear that she was no temporary regent by doing that. Meretseger, in her physical manifestation of the hill, basically watched over all of the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens, Deir el-Medina, etc. And in her metaphorical, metaphysical manifestation, she also guarded and protected everyone as well. The final goddess for this episode is associated with the oldest royal necropolis, but she doesn't appear in the archaeological record until the 19th dynasty, so after all of the previous goddesses that we've gone through. Her name is Hapetnebes, and she's the personification of the part of the necropolis at Abydos that we now call el-Kab, which in Arabic means mother of pots. Hapetnebes means she who hides our Lord, which is also in reference to motherhood, in that she is said to hide Osiris's tomb physically, as in the landscape hides his tomb, but also metaphorically as the womb where Osiris regenerates and then is reborn from after his full life cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So while on the surface, El-Kab, mother of pots, was named that because of the large amount of votive pottery that's been found there, I do find it interesting that the motherhood concept also continued to stay with this location, even through language changes and many, many, many centuries. There are no identified artistic depictions of Hapetnebes. She's only mentioned in texts. And the first mention begins in the 19th dynasty, which during this time, this was when the Osiris cult was becoming really, really popular with the royal family. Seti I built a temple to Osiris here at Abydos, and the belief that this was where Osiris's tomb was really took hold and grew amongst the ancient Egyptian belief system. A lot of researchers believe that this cult of Osiris becoming so deeply attached to the Abydos Necropolis was a bit of a cultural memory, because that is the place where the first dynastic tombs are and the pre-dynastic tombs for that transition period. So ultimately, this is where the first kings of Egypt were buried. And Osiris being seen as the deified king and the king of the underworld, essentially, it makes sense that he would become tied to this place. And Abydos is also where we've found the oldest evidence of Osiris worship. So essentially, by the New Kingdom, all of this kept building on top of each other to become the large, heavily believed across Egypt religion at this time. And there were huge festivals celebrated everywhere, the mysteries of Osiris. And curiously about the Hapetnebes name is her name and identity continue to be used in the 21st dynasty, which was during the Third Intermediate period, and after there had been a lot of political and social upheaval during the time. There's a stela that was found at Abydos that dates to the rule of Osorkon I, who was one of the earliest rulers within Dynasty 21, one of the earlier ones, not the first, but anyways. And the stela talks of someone finding an old dedication to Hapetnebes. So this stela also specifically states that their belief and concept of this goddess is also built upon the history of this place, because it goes on to say that he restored that and then built a temple there. So though no temple has been found there, the stela has been found that references it. And I think it's very interesting that the history there, the way that the history at Abydos specifically has continued to build onto itself, but in more and more mythological ways. Hapetnebes continued to be named as the personification of the Abydan Necropolis here into the Ptolemaic and early Roman periods. So she was the newest of the goddesses that we saw in this episode, and also she lasted the latest, though not necessarily the longest. I believe Imentet or Amentet would hold that title for the longest worshipped of these goddesses. All four of these goddesses show us that the protection of the divine feminine was a very important part of afterlife beliefs in ancient Egypt. Royals and workers alike entrusted their bodies and souls to them. And since deities and afterlife beliefs are heavily influenced by social norms and the expectations, they also show us that women were an important part of daily life as providers and protectors in ancient Egypt. Thanks for joining me for this episode about the goddesses of Necropolises. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.